The Yedida Kalfon Stillman Memorial Lecture was established through the generosity of friends and family and colleagues in honor of the memory of Yedida Kalfon Stillman, beloved teacher, mentor, world-renowned scholar, who died in February 1998 of cancer. The first memorial lecture was given in 2001 by Professor Paula Sanders of Rice University. And the Yedida Kalfon Stillman Memorial Lectures have all been distinguished scholars thus far, all in fields related to Yedida Kalfon Stillman's unusually wide-ranging interests in Middle East and Sephardic history, culture. Born in Morocco and raised in Israel, Yedida Kalfon Stillman and Professor Norman, or as most of us know him, Noam Stillman, worked together as a team for many years at Binghamton University. They came here and founded our Judaic Studies program here at OU now about 25 years ago. Yedida Kalfon Stillman was the author of many scholarly books and articles, including what is still considered, I'm told, the definitive history of Arab dress from the dawn of Islam through modern times. I wish that we could, in most years, display Yedida's many publications and works. And God willing, next year we will be able to do exactly that. Yedida's works are still widely read and widely cited. And this talk is in her memory and in her honor. I believe that Yedida would be very pleased with tonight's scholar, Professor Aimée Israel-Pelletier, who is the professor of French literature and the head of the French section at the University of Texas, Arlington. Her research focuses on 19th, 20th, 21st century French and Francophone literatures of the Middle East, including North Africa, visual culture, art history, literature, Francophone and Anglophone literature, colonialism and post-colonialism, feminism, and if that weren't enough, she also teaches courses in medieval and Renaissance French literature. Prior to coming to UT Arlington, Professor Israel-Pelletier was a professor at the University of Rochester, Eastman School of Music, very, very distinguished school of music, and Louisiana State University. She received her PhD from Rutgers, and before that got degrees from the Sorbonne, where she distinguished herself and studied with some of the most eminent people in the field. Her list of publications is long and imposing, and I won't take too much time because I'm sure we'd all rather hear Professor Israel-Pelletier speak and then hear her CV recited. But I will just mention a couple to show the range of her intellectual interests. Flaubert's Straight and Suspect Saints, The Unity of Trois Camps, Rimbaud, Impressionist Poetics, Vision and Visuality, The History and Culture of Jews in Egypt in Modern Times. And I can see from names and know from histories that there are at least several people in this audience biographically connected to the Jews of Egypt, which is really something wonderful. Une société méditerranéenne et nilotique, Les écrivains juifs d'Égypte. You'll forgive my accent, I hope. New Directions in Sephardi Mizrahi Migrations in Global Contexts, published by Bar-Ilan University. So loads of interests, several languages, and a lot of fans among her students as well. It is my great honor to introduce tonight's 21st Yedida Kalfon Stillman Memorial Lecturer, Professor Aimée Israel-Pelletier, who'll be speaking tonight on the topic of On the Mediterranean and the Nile, the Jews of Egypt. Aimée, take it away.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much for this very generous introduction. I think you went right into my files. You know how those files now just keep growing. Thank you. Thank you. And I also want to thank the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies for inviting me. And I don't want to miss thanking Professor Noam Stillman for his friendship over the years and for his guidance. I'm truly honored to be here. I was motivated to write the book because the talk I understood from Alan was about the book that came out in 2018. I was motivated to write the book to address a couple of questions that people asked over the years. The most common was born of surprise. There were Jews in Egypt? This was usually followed up with, how can you be Egyptian and Jewish? Now, I took this to mean, how was it like for a Jew to live in an Arab country? And how is this even possible? Now, I was old enough and lucky enough to know my grandparents and to have many aunts, uncles, and cousins older than me. I also do remember some things, mostly school and family life in Cairo and Alexandria. Growing up in New Jersey, I would hear families say things like, life was good for the Jews before Nasser, but then he turned against us. I also heard things like, before Nasser, Jews, Muslims, and Christians were on friendly relations. They visited, partied, attended each other's weddings, and so forth. I myself remember, for example, that in my parents' house, the son of a family friend from the countryside, a Muslim family, came to live with us in Cairo for a year while he attended university. No money was exchanged, just friends. So listening to family and other Egyptian Jews describe what it was like in Egypt in the early 20th century, relying on my own childhood memories and reading memoirs of individual experiences, I was able to piece together a general but incomplete picture. I seriously wanted to fill in the context. So I began by reading scholars on the Middle East and Egypt, historians, political scientists, social scientists, and as a scholar of literature myself, using the tools of the trade, I examined the fiction, poetry, and other forms of writing by Egyptian Jews. I wanted to explore the history, the culture, and the zeitgeist, the feelings, the thoughts. I didn't want to rely just on anecdotal evidence. In short, I wanted to know how Egyptian Jews thought about their collective identity, how they responded to the changes taking place in Egypt in the first half of the 20th century, and what it was like for them, born and raised in Egypt, to feel that suddenly, much like Moses felt, they were designated as foreigners in a foreign land. Now, I hold the view that what we call literature is the framing of questions that are important to the writers themselves and to the collective they address and mirror for us. Literature, good literature, serious literature, is not made up of lies and flights of fancy. Rather, it is a mode of critical reflection, deliberating on questions that weigh heavily on the mind. But I also must say that the most compelling reason for writing this book is that over the years, I had come across people, academics and others, who stated as fact that the Jews in Egypt were colonizers who exploited Egypt, that they sided with the British and French, that they had shallow roots, didn't care about Egypt, didn't consider themselves Egyptian. Now, something about these statements sounded wrong to me. I personally had a weak attachment to Egypt, but then I left Egypt in 1961. I was 12 years old. Now you know my age. And when I came to America, I absolutely, absolutely fell in love with it and felt immediately at home. I didn't look back. Certainly, I didn't feel Egyptian, but my grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles did think of themselves as Egyptians. But what did that mean for people whose official papers identified them as stateless and who were compelled, even forced, to flee? How did they feel about Egypt? And how did they imagine their sense of belonging as Egyptian Jews? That's the sort of questions I explore in this book. What I came across, the works I examined, confirmed that Egypt meant a great deal. The bond was powerful. I'll explain. Let me start with this. It sounds whimsical, even silly, but actually, I think it's important. The modern Jews of Egypt were and are connected to Egypt by ties as ancient as Judaism itself. This history is not lost on them. Rehearsing yearly the Passover story, Egyptian Jews in the diaspora recognize they lived the part to the very end. Whether they lived in Egypt for centuries or decades, they personally connected with biblical scenes and with stories that were reinforced over and over in the landscape around them. The work of Jacqueline Kahanoff, the Talmudic book of questions of Edmond Jabès, Jacques Hassoun's reflections on identity and displacement, Paula Jacques and André Asseman's novels. These are the writers whose work I examine in the book. Their work illustrate with insight that connection. For the modern Jews of Egypt, the Nile, the pyramids, and the Sinai were there in front of their eyes and on the tip of their tongues to remind them that they shared the very same land as their biblical ancestors. Egypt for them, for me, as a child, was not only Nasser's Egypt or Farouk's Egypt or the British or the French. It did not matter much that millennia had gone by, that Egyptian Jews were probably not direct descendants. The scholar of Iraqi Jewry, the anthropologist Shlomo Deshen, argues in a similar vein that modern Iraqi Jews think of themselves as belonging to the same people as the Babylonian exiles, even though no Iraqi could trace ancestors before the 17th century. And so it is for Egyptian Jews. They internalized important episodes in Judaism, stories about Joseph, his brothers, their father Jacob, Moses, of course, and the Exodus. Edmond Jabès said, the pharaohs barely belong to the past. As a child growing up in Cairo, I felt that way. The Nile in front of me was the same river Nile where Moses's mother and his sister Miriam placed him in a basket for Pharaoh's daughter to find. And I, like many around me, were always amused during Passover Seder to learn that we had left Egypt with Moses. No one had told me that my ancestors arrived in Egypt in the 1880s from Aleppo, Baghdad, Livorno, and Tunis. Anyway, it would not have mattered. In the imaginary, in the unconscious, where all kinds of thoughts and images coexist, and where free association and contradictions meet no resistance, it would not have mattered. I agree with Toby Nathan, the psychoanalyst and ethnopsychologist, also an Egyptian Jew, when he points out that Egyptian Jews have a privileged relationship with the founding narrative of Judaism. He argues, whether we believe the biblical ancestors are historically real or not, the story we tell about our collective identity as Jews is powerful and personal. Present-day Egyptian Jews, he adds, are in this respect the actual Jews we learn about in the Torah. And I quote him, the Jewish community of Egypt is unique. It is the only generation that came out of Egypt, but it was not Moses, but Nasser who took us out. My own view is that for Egyptian Jews, whether they think consciously about it or not, there is virtually no distinction between the ancient Jews and their modern counterparts. To be clear, I don't mean for this ancient drama to serve as a standalone narrative supporting Jewish Egyptian sense of belonging. Rather, I want to point out that this ancient drama follows closely serious debates that took place in Egypt in the decades before and after Egypt gained its independence from the Ottoman and British Empire. So we're talking 1917, 1922. A period in Egypt's modern history that tracks Egypt's experiment with liberal governance and ends with the victory of Nasser and Pan-Arabism. The debate during that period focused on Egyptian identity. So now that Egypt was no longer Ottoman, now that it was independent, the debate was concerned with defining who was Egyptian. What were the conditions necessary to be considered an Egyptian? The debate was between liberals and Arab and Muslim nationalists. For their part, liberal Egypt stressed Egypt's unique geography and the distinguished history of its pharaonic past. They saw the pharaoh's heritage as the only authentic national heritage. And they posited further that Egypt had an independent national culture separate from that of the Arab and Muslim legacy. Egypt was Mediterranean and Nilotic. When the debate was settled around 1952, its effects were disastrous for the Jewish community. The sea change from liberal to Arab nationalism caught Jews, as often Jews get caught, as one political system is replaced by another. The Jewish community in Egypt at its peak in the late 1940s numbered between 80 and some say 90,000 people. Today, there are fewer than 15 individuals, none are children, and the youngest, Magda Haroun, the president of the Jewish community, is in her 70s. At one time, vibrant and influential, Egypt's Jewish community has vanished, leaving behind priceless artifacts, synagogues dating back to the 12th century, the community's registers, and the second oldest Jewish cemetery in the world, the 9th century Basatine Cemetery. Most are in disrepair. Indications are that a few synagogues are receiving the protection of El-Sisi's government, and others have been allowed to undergo restoration, such as the gorgeous Eliyahu HaNavi in Alexandria. I consider my work part of this project, making known this community's rich intellectual, literary, and cultural production, past and ongoing, and hope that many, many more follow. A bit of historical background. Egyptian Jews living in the first half of the 20th century were never more than a small minority among Egypt's many minorities. Yet by all accounts, as in biblical times, they contributed in remarkable ways to Egypt's prosperity. Between the first decades of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th, Egypt witnessed unprecedented economic growth and population expansion. From a country of, take this, 4.5 million in 1800, it counted 24 million people in the mid 20th century. We won't talk about today, right? Starting in the early 19th century, Egypt began modernizing and expanding its urban, institutional, and military infrastructure. It built canals, expanded railways, developed new ports, and enlarged existing ports. It built an impressive fleet of steamships. It opened channels into global commerce and became incorporated into the world economy. An ambitious urban development program transformed a mostly medieval Cairo into what was dubbed Paris on the Nile. Of consequence to Egypt's enormous growth and paradoxically to its fall was the construction of the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869. It allowed Egypt to compete for commercial traffic, expand its markets, and further attract opportunity seekers. Workers, craftsmen, entrepreneurs, and political refugees were drawn to Egypt at a time when the use of passports and nationality documents was not standard. They arrived from the Balkans, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, Macedonia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Croatia, many from Greece and Turkey, Armenia, Italy, France, North Africa, the Levant, and of course, Iraq. Many settled permanently and others were seasonal. Egypt offered something close to the American dream, a Mediterranean country harboring a dynamic and open society, a booming economy, fueled by a desire for modernization. Egypt attracted immigrants like a magnet. As I pointed out before, between 1800 and 1957, the Egyptian population grew exponentially. The population of the country's largest city, Cairo, grew 12 times. It is staggering to contemplate that from 1897 to 1907, only 10 years, the number of Cairo's residents who had been born outside Egypt, that includes non-Jews, of course, Jews and non-Jews, increased from roughly 35,000 to 75,000. And the same was true of Alexandria. Cairo and Alexandria were the cities of choice for immigrants, newly arrived Jews, non-Jews, and Egyptians leaving the countryside for the cities. Over the 19th century, there was a 50-fold expansion in Egypt's foreign trade. It was in this dynamic setting, cosmopolitan and liberal, that the Jewish community thrived and bonded anew with Egypt. The community was diverse on several levels, including economically. Some members of the community became remarkably successful, contributing significantly to Egypt's growth. Besides their prominence in banking and as brokers, merchants, and distributors, they played a major part in building and developing Egypt's urban centers, its railway, hospitals, schools, refineries, and department stores. They served on commercial courts, in mixed tribunals. They founded learned associations, were involved in philanthropic work, and even participated in the liberal Waft government that was started in 1919 to 1952. There were immensely wealthy Jewish families, but there were also many artisans, jewelers, seamstresses, tailors, and accountants. In the 1920s and 30s, Jews occupied a pivotal position in the film industry. I recommend very highly to you Deborah Starr's recent book on Togo Mizrahi. So this generation of men who came of age in the 1940s and 1950s, my father's and uncle's generation, joined the ranks of a rising professional class, the Ifandiyya. There were university-educated lawyers, there were doctors, there were engineers, teachers, writers, and journalists. In this upwardly mobile urban society, most Jews could be counted among the striving middle classes. I should also add Not all Jews were urban dwellers, and not all belonged to the middle classes. In short, the history of Egyptian Jewry from roughly 1900 to 1950, a period marked by liberal ideas in politics, business, and culture, Egyptian Jews had good reason to believe they were an integral part of modern Egypt. This optimism existed despite the fact that most Jews were not granted Egyptian nationality. This was because, in the first place, laws defining nationality arrived late to Egypt in 1929. And in the second place, when they were granted, citizenship was nearly exclusively granted to Muslims, even when these co-religionists did not reside in Egypt. The anti-foreign and anti-Jewish policies of Egyptian public officials were never too far below the surface. With time, as Arab and Muslim nationalisms gained adherents, these policies presented intractable problems for Jews who were not willing to renounce Judaism. So, did Jews feel they were part of Egypt? Were they attached to the country by bonds of loyalty and kinship? My answer is yes. In saying so, I keep in mind that the Mediterranean region, its southern and northern shores, has always been marked by the movement of peoples, commerce, and knowledge. Egypt was one of the richest and most diverse provinces under the Greeks and Roman empires, and the most prosperous under the Ottomans. It attracted many peoples from throughout the Mediterranean continuously. What happened during the 19th and early 20th centuries, as I pointed out earlier, had been happening for centuries, and Jews were always a part of that dynamic exchange. Jews are a Mediterranean people, as the work of the celebrated historian S.D. Goitein on the Geniza documents has concluded, has established. It is not surprising, therefore, that a significant Jewish community was present in Egypt without interruption for over 2,000 years. Jews lived in the Nile Valley, in Egypt's deserts, and it's on its Mediterranean shore, at least since 1220 BCE. Much later, a sizable community lived there after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. Jews had a significant presence in Alexandria, Cairo, Tanta, Asyut, and other Egyptian cities at the time of Alexander the Great. Later, in Ptolemaic Egypt, around the 4th century BCE, a large, acculturated, and visible community prospered. One of its achievements, as most of you know, was translating the Bible into Greek. Centuries later, in Egypt, during the Roman and Byzantine empires, Jews continued to be represented in all walks of life and in significant numbers. A large Jewish community existed in Egypt when it was captured by the Arabs between 639 CE and 642 CE. Like the Copts, Jews interacted with the new rulers throughout the following centuries. They lived alongside them and negotiated terms of coexistence for their communities. At times, these terms strengthened and at other times weakened the communities. I draw the point in my book that the Jewish community in Egypt in the first half of the 20th century considered itself Egyptian and was committed to Egypt's prosperity. I take therefore issue with the view of some scholars that seeks to distinguish between what they call local Jews, presumably those who arrived in the 19th century, and so-called foreign Jews who arrived later. I take issue with this erroneous and really unhelpful distinction on several grounds. Most important is that it singles out Jews as foreigners without taking account of the fact that Egypt's population during the 19th century, as I tried to show earlier, had grown exponentially. The growth is attributed to diverse migrations, not only Jewish. By the mid 20th century, if not before, most members of the Jewish community had been born in Egypt. There would have been at least one generation separating newcomer families from their first native born child. In the space of one generation, most would have found it possible to set aside certain regional customs, different cuisine preparations, foreign or peculiar idioms and accents, and would have found these and other singularities, if not endearing, then pretexts for playful teasing and put downs. After the first generation, if not before, Jews who arrived in the middle of the 19th century and those who were there before them and those who came after them could be said to share some things and not others, and yet still consider themselves to be of one family. Rare were the families that did not overlap or intertwine ethnic and historical heritage. It was not uncommon to find individuals, often young men, but women as well, and families immigrating to Egypt from, say, Baghdad, Aleppo, Izmir, or Tunis, with the expectation that they would reunite with remnants of their families and acquaintances dating back decades or generations. The Jewish community in Egypt had dealt with many waves of Jewish immigration. It had a communal structure and networks of relations that by all accounts were able to bring together Jews from different territories and religious congregations. This was as true in earlier times in Egypt as it was in more recent history. For example, in the 11th century, when Egypt was home to two major congregations, one that followed the Babylonian Talmud and the other the Jerusalem Talmud. And even though each community struggled to preserve its character, differences did not polarize the overall community. An indication of this is that when Jews from the Maghreb arrived in Egypt, and even though they were mainly followers of the Babylonian Talmud, Maghrebis could be found in both congregations. Reflecting on this, as de Goitein writes, and I quote him here, "It is natural that such competitions between the two Talmuds and hence congregations, would sometimes lead to friction between the leaders of the congregations or even between their members. But according to our documents, the two congregations appear throughout the classical Geniza period as belonging to one community. Witness the fact that the public chest was administered in common. As a rule, donations were made and fines stipulated or imposed for the benefit of the two synagogues in equal shares." Close quotes. The resilience and flexibility of the Jewish community is demonstrated in another example. When Sephardi Jews arrived in Egypt in the 15th century during the Spanish expulsions, it did not take long before the existing Jewish communities and these new immigrants found common ground. At first, the newcomers organized their own congregations, courts, and charitable institutions. However, despite the new divisions, the overall organization encompassing all Jewish groups remained intact. This was also the case when Ashkenazi Jews, fleeing the pogroms in Russia and Poland, arrived in the 17th century and the 20th centuries. And then later, when they fled the Nazis. And it was the case in 1914, when between 11,000 and 12,000 Jews of the Yishuv arrived in Egypt after their expulsion from Palestine by the Ottoman Turks. Each time Jewish immigrants came to Egypt, whether under duress or by choice, the community accommodated them, and their interactions changed both the so-called local Jews and the newcomers. During these times, Jewish communal autonomy continued and presented a unified front. Egyptian Jews had been interacting, trading, and intermarrying with other Jews for centuries. Egypt was, during most of its history, a hospitable place, and Egyptian Jews had this cultural trait ingrained in them such that it colored their dealings with Jewish and non-Jewish newcomers alike. It is not surprising that their disposition would extend to their diverse co-religionists in whom they recognized a common bond in Judaism. In short, again, as Shlomo Deschen observes, when Jews migrate, they seldom establish new communities separate from their co-religionists. They mix, adapt, accommodate each other. On a personal note, when my own family came to the United States and settled in New Jersey, we became members of an Ashkenazi synagogue in Newark, New Jersey, and learned to recite and chant in the Ashkenazi fashion. We began to pepper our language with Yiddish expressions, laughed at Yiddish jokes, served matzo ball soup at our table, easily befriended, identified with, and married Ashkenazi Jews. At our Passover Seders, we might have quibbled about whether we could eat kitniot or not, but we made adjustments. But of course, the battle of the kitniot continues in my household. I think it is important to emphasize that the long history of the Egyptian Jewish community intertwined not only with that of other Jews, but with the history of other Egyptians as well. Egyptian Jews were culturally speaking Egyptian. They shared the same cuisine, listened to the same music, saw the same films, attended the same operas, walked the same streets, laughed at the same jokes. They worked, interacted with, and lived in the same neighborhoods and same buildings as other Egyptians, Muslim and Christian, who were members, obviously, of the same socioeconomic class. As far as language is concerned, even though many Jews spoke French, as did other Egyptians of the middle and upper classes, favoring it as the language of high culture and the Enlightenment. I mean, where in the world was that not the case in the 19th and early 20th century? But Jews also spoke Arabic. Arabic was ubiquitous. In liberal Egypt, many Jews and non-Jews alike aspired to lead modern lives and adopted the model of secularization practiced by the ruling classes and other elites from the time of Muhammad Ali's reforms in the 1800s. Having said that, one must recognize, and I certainly do, that the addition of tens of millions of inhabitants did not merely expand Egypt's population, it transformed it. These changes created structural inequalities, which resulted in discontent and echoed in the speeches of Arab and Muslim nationalists, stifling the budding ideals of Egyptian liberalism and the future for reform. Eventually, it suppressed it completely. The end of the Jewish community came about because Egyptian Jews could not fit into a collective project whose understanding of citizenship, as Yoav Di Capua puts it so well, is a collective project that emphasized commitment to the heritage of Islam. Egyptian Jews were spared the unimaginable brutality of the Nazis and the tragic fate of European and many North African Jews. Instead, Egyptian Jews were subjected to economic and, I want to underline, psychological pressures construed to eradicate them. Anti-foreign and anti-Jewish policies were imposed on the community after 1948, the date at which Israel was recognized as a state for the Jewish people. And many Egyptian Jews, young and old, were imprisoned, accused of Zionist collaboration and communist organizing. But it was the attack on the Suez Canal by England, France, and Israel that quickened the demise of the community, as policies that targeted Jews became most severe. There were restrictive measures on employment in every sector of the economy. Licenses were revoked arbitrarily. Sequestrations, confiscations, and nationalization of businesses were applied indiscriminately against Jews. The novels of the French writer Paul Ajac and of the American André Aciman bear witness to these hardships. These policies and the failed wars against Israel all combined to guarantee that no Jewish presence of note would exist in Egypt for the first time in millennia. Many Jews were summarily expelled in 1956, 1957, and 1967. The continued economic and existential hardships, the social isolation, the daily humiliation, and the hostile acts directed against the Jews who remained became unbearable. Even the decision to leave was made difficult by the authorities. And when Jews did acquire permission to leave, all were forced to sign a document stating they would never return. Arab nationalism was effectively the end of the road for Egyptian Jews. In closing, I have been suggesting that for Egyptian Jews, for the 5 writers that my book is about, Egypt is a real place, one that figures a home that is lost. It is where the roots of the Jewish people will always be, even though at this time they are gone, except for the 15 or so still there. Toby Nathan, whose family left Egypt in 1957, recalls that in France, on the last Passover he spent with his father, who was 91 years old, there were about 20 people gathered around the table to celebrate once again the exodus from Egypt, la sortie d'Égypte, when his father uttered these words: "The main thing is that we're together." Nathan gives these words their full expression as follows: you can go out and see the world, see things, see people, but you cannot leave your people. The main thing is that we're together. Nathan then tells the story of a bird who could fly anywhere he wanted. But if you watched closely, you would see that the bird always came back to the same branch. The bird comes back to its people and to its ancestral place. The flight from Egypt is a lived experience for the Jewish Egyptian community, acutely aware, as it is, that it has reenacted the biblical story in its own time. Finally, during the Passover Seder, all Jews around the world are instructed to act as if they personally went out from Egypt. In a fundamental sense, all Jews did, but not all can say, as Egyptian Jews can, they actually and personally lived that experience. Thank you.